Hey everybody. Hey, what's going on? Just today, I'm gonna be making just a random video about just random CIA notes that I was just kind of taking for fun, just kind of connecting dots, kind of a bored hobby, really. Um, but this is some fascinating history here, and this is real history. Um, and I don't really know where to begin this video. It's going to be kind of all over the place, but the main gist is just to kind of just talk about how fascinating the CIA was in the Cold War when a lot of kind of shady stuff was going on, from arms dealing, plausible drug dealing, even though we all kind of can agree that the CIA was likely involved heavily in drug smuggling, and then also like assassins, etc. Let me see here. I think, let me go. Here we go. Like for example, right? I just made like a random uh kind of note or whatnot based on just like research and everything like that of just for example, who would the CIA call upon in the Cold War to take care of dirty business? Um, one thing that the CIA as well as other intelligence agencies like to do is to kind of get in bed with the underbelly of society, the criminal underworld. If you can control or have tabs on the criminal underworld, you can do a whole lot. That's where you can smuggle the weapons, the drugs. You can get the enforcers, etc. And the CIA was not immune to that type of behavior. So, in all this, the random notes that I have, this was just one of them. I call it the Rolodex of CIA assassins. And the CIA would tap into, from what I can garner or kind of determine, were interestingly Cuban anti-communist dissidents. So a lot of the Bay of Pig veterans, a lot of the Cuban Americans who were recruited by the CIA and trained in places like the swamps and bayous of New Orleans, which actually kind of connects to the JFK assassination plot theory, one of the many theories. Many of the Cuban Americans were trained in the bayous of Louisiana, right outside of New Orleans, because it mimicked the terrain of Cuba. But they were also trained in like Mexico, Guatemala, Puerto Rico, kind of all over the general Caribbean, Central America territory by the CIA. But after the Bay of Pigs failed, um, many of those Cubans still had connections with the CIA, and it seems that they were called upon from time to time to handle business. And some of these Cubans found themselves in faraway places doing dirty work for the CIA, such as for the CIA in Congo during the Congo Crisis. That's essentially when Patrice Lumumba took over power, and the Western powers didn't like that, so they got rid of him, and it just led to pretty much like a civil war sort of situation, because the Congo was essentially just another chess piece in the larger Cold War between the USSR, Russia, and the United States. But you had Cubans over there. You had Cubans from Castro, Cuba, trying to support kind of left wing, the more of the communist forces. But you also had the United States backing right wing forces, and they were actually sending some of the veterans of the Bay of Pigs invasion over there. One of those being Ricardo Morales Navarrete, who was actually a notorious drug dealer and informant himself, who was later killed in Miami in some sort of shady bar situation. But we'll go more into that later. So, the CIA, for example, looks like they would call upon Cuban anti-communist dissidents, and they had all these various kind of factions called like Cuban Power, Alpha 66, Omega 7, the Coordination of United Revolutionary Organization, the Cuban Democratic Front, etc. And some of the notable members of the Cuban anti-communist dissident movement were, like I said, Ricardo Morales Navarrete, or Navarre. Orlando Bosch, Luis Correals, Rafael Villaverde, and Rafael Villaverde, who we'll go more into detail about later, was actually involved in something called Operation TikToks, which was a sting operation in which a lot of these Cuban Bay of Pig veterans were caught up in drug smuggling with Bolivia. So therefore, you have a direct connection between Bay of Pig Cuban veterans, anti-communist dissidents, working with Bolivian drug dealers, and by proxy, most likely Medellin cocaine drug dealers. So just it goes to show how the CIA is just one degree away from organizations and groups who have the ability to smuggle drugs. But you don't really hear too much about the Cuban CIA drug smuggling connection. You hear about Cubans, of course, Scarface type mythology that's very popular, but you never really hear about the actual Bay of Pig veterans kind of caught up and involved in a lot of that stuff too. Um, Another group that the CIA would tap into is, of course, Nazi war criminals and Euro-fascists, typically used to kind of intimidate, hurt, murder, workers' rights groups, unions, things of that nature to kind of make sure that post-war Europe was kind of staying away from leaning too far left. And unfortunately, the CIA got in bed, as is well known and documented, with Nazi war criminals, um, particularly actively helping them get out of Europe through the U.S. Army CIC Counterintelligence Command and the CIA precursor Office of Strategic Services OSS. So the CIA OSS would basically use these Nazi war criminals, get them off the hook, and put them into positions of power, notably in like West Germany, the Bonn government, I believe, is what they called it back then, to essentially kind of make sure that post-war Europe didn't go too far left. So some of these groups were Odessa, like the Odessa rat line networks, basically getting Nazis out to the Vatican, sending them to Latin America. Dispina is an organization, I believe, that was founded by Hitler commando Otto Skorzeny, and then also Scorseny's Paladin group, which was kind of like a Blackwater mercenary group based out of Spain, operated and owned by Otto Scorseni, that hired, I believe, a bunch of ex-Nazis to be kind of mercenaries to help train right-wing dictators, suppress rebellions, teach them about torture techniques, etc. So you have to realize, just like the Cuban nationals, the Cuban anti-communist dissidents, you also had these Nazi war criminals just one degree away from Central Intelligence oversight, connections, etc. So two of the most prominent kind of Nazis, of course, we know Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, but other people are SS member Klaus Barbie, in other words, the Butcher of Leon. He actually ran away to Bolivia, and if you have Tubi, the free TV service, there's a good documentary called My Enemy's Enemy. And it's actually about how Klaus Barbie escaped to Bolivia under a fake alias. I think it was Klaus Altman. And he never disavowed his Nazi beliefs, but he ended up actually becoming very close and in bed with the Bolivian government, training them on torture and interrogation techniques, and was kind of a made man in Bolivia, but actually helped the Bolivian corrupt government actually like smuggle drugs, cocaine. A lot of the Bolivian coca leaves were, of course, processed in Colombia, which was therefore processed later by the Medellin cartel, therefore actually being, shipped over into the United States. And I forgot his name, but there was actually some Colombian, German, American guy who was like some Hispanic Nazi or whatnot. They kind of briefly touch upon his character in the movie Blow with Johnny Depp. I'll look his name up real quick on my phone, but it's just very interesting that he was like this Hispanic Nazi guy, who was like dealing cocaine. So it's just this weird overlap between like Latin American right wing fascists and like Nazis. Um, and That's just interesting there. But there are some, but to stay on topic, the Nazi war criminals. In this group, they also had French fascist groups like the French OAS, SAC, and many anti-Libya pro-colonial groups. So they were basically French terrorists who were trying to intimidate the Libyans and everything into staying with France. But they were also some of these kind of like leftovers of the Vichy French regime who were like kind of fascist and in bed with the Nazis themselves. You also interestingly had Ukrainian ultranationalists, particularly of the pro-Bandera factions. So Bandera was a kind of he's kind of hailed as a hero in Ukraine, but Ukraine in World War II was kind of in a sticky situation because they didn't want to be conquered by the Soviets, so they got in bed and collaborated with Nazi Germany, even though there's documented cases of Ukrainians actually killing the Nazis, who were giving them like weapons and arms. So the Ukrainians kind of played both sides of the war for their own kind of, ethnic group independence. Um, but it is proven that the OSS, through people like Frank Wisner, one of the OSS's, I think, chief policy planner type people, higher up in the what will become the CIA. Frank Wisner was actually the brainchild behind stay behind units. So stay behind units were these kind of clandestine underground secret armies, basically, kind of cells, cadres, um, who were funded by the CIA and other kind of Western governments to basically be sleeper cells in the event that the Soviets actually invaded Europe. But the only problem, though, is that the CIA were essentially just funding drug dealers and neo Nazis and fascists. And unfortunately, some of the Ukrainian ultranationalist groups kind of got involved in some of that stuff themselves. Um, but also there are also White Russians. So White Russians are actually kind of Soviet defectors from Russia proper, or the larger Soviet Union, who became kind of CIA assets as well. And because they were able to fit in with kind of the Soviet Union culture or whatnot, they were able to kind of be the CIA's kind of men behind the lines to conduct clandestine operations. Another group we have is the Turkish Grey Wolves. And the Turkish Grey Wolves are interesting because they're kind of they're a political kind of group, gang or whatnot. Um, More of a political group, right wing, very right wing, who believe in Turkish kind of supremacy and everything. Um, and they interestingly were also propped up by the CIA stay behind unit networks, NATO, CIA stay behind units. So the Grey Wolves were kind of like this proxy unit, but they had a lot of ties to the military, the police. Um, so they were kind of like the brown shirts to like the actual government in Turkey, who were kind of suppressing left wing sentiment, workers unions groups, and also notably terrorizing the Kurdish population. Um, but the Turkish Grey Wolves were very interesting because they were also involved in drug dealing heavily. And you have to realize that the Turkish have a very large population in Germany, notably at the time West Germany, which therefore goes back to a slight connection with the Eurofascists. Because we have to remember, or just to throw out this random fact, that the West German intelligence, the BND, was actually ran by an ex-Nazi, Reinhard Gehlen, who was the West German kind of like director of their intelligence over there. So you had, basically Euro-fascists in West Germany, France, and all that type of stuff. But you also had, Turkish fascists in Turkey. We had a large Turkish population in Germany, so they kind of dealt heroin and opium there, but they were also kind of like assassins and all this type of stuff who could be called upon. by the BND or CIA or whomever to basically do contract kills and stuff like that. But two members of the Grey Wolves who are notable are a person named Abdullah Catali, Catli. He was a heroin dealer, member of the Grey Wolves, political thug, who would basically kill Kurds and leftists and stuff like that. He was actually killed in a car accident, but in the car with him was a high-ranking member of the Turkish government. So it kind of exposed the kind of Turkish Grey Wolf stay-behind unit connection. But another person of the Grey Wolves is a person named Mehmet Aka or Akra. Mehmet actually is the person who shot John Paul II, which is very interesting. There's some theories that the assassination attempt on John Paul II's life was actually some sort of weird intelligence plots or something. I'm not 100% sure. Um, they kind of make it seem as if the Soviets tried to kill the Pope, even though the Soviets denied it. They tried to blame the Bulgarians, and the Bulgarians, of course, were part of the Soviet sphere of influence. But it's likely possible that the BND, via Reinhard Gehlen, an ex-Nazi, may have had contact with Abdullah Catli, the Turkish Grey Wolf drug dealer and assassin, and Catli most likely knew Mehmet Aka. So there's this weird kind of NATO CIA underbelly. It's the assassination attempt of John Paul II. And the CIA director at the time was a person named William Casey. William Casey is important, and even to this day, because he founded an organization called the Manhattan Institute of Urban Studies. And the Manhattan Institute is essentially just a right wing organization who just does a bunch of right wing punditry and stuff like that. But they actually have connections to the mainstream media today, and also to people like Peter Thiel, the ex business partner of Elon Musk. So you have the Turkish Grey Wolves, Nazis, Euro-fascists, Cuban anti-communist dissidents, but you also had the Corsican Mob, and the Corsican Mob played a huge role, notably through the French Connection heroin trade that everybody knows about. Two notable people in the Corsican Mob was Lucien Sarti, who is actually one of many people accused of actually shooting John F. Kennedy. Some suspected that he was one of the gunmen on the grassy knoll, but I believe that story was discredited in part. That theory, I believe, comes from E. Howard Hunt's son, who tried to I guess make up. He basically told this story about how Lucien Sarti was the quote unquote French man who tried to shoot JFK or shot JFK. But some JFK kind of scholars kind of discredit that. But regardless, we do know that the Corsican mob had big ties with the U.S. Italian La Cosa Nostra Italian mob, and they would ship the heroin over from Southeast Asia, um, to Corsica, to Marseille, and to the United States. But the Corsicans had a very cozy relationship with the Italian mob. But before I move on, another member notable of the Corsican mob is a person named Auguste Record. And Auguste Record actually was a Corsican mob member who was in bed with the Vichy French fascist government who were pro-Nazi. So that kind of just goes to show more of this right-wing Nazi kind of involvement in the international drug trade, and also their collaboration with the CIA because of their anti-left-wing, anti-progressive standpoints. Um, but anyways, we keep going down. We can also see La Cosa Nostra, the Italian mob, or La Cosa Nostra. Um, and interesting, there's a person, Johnny Roselli of the Chicago outfit, Johnny Rosselli, interestingly, there's a story actually where allegedly um, Sammy Davis Jr. of the Rat Pack ended up dating a white woman, and because Sammy Davis Jr. of course being black at that time, like the 1950s 60s, it was controversial. But because he was also in the music industry that the mob highly owned and controlled, they sent Johnny Roselli out to threaten um, Sammy Davis Jr. to basically break up his marriage with this white actress. I forgot her name. Um, but it's interesting. I'll probably pull up a video on that. But he basically threatened to like rip out one of Sammy Davis Jr.'s other eyes or something if he didn't do what the mob said. So just not a nice person. But Johnny Rosselli was also, I want to say, he actually. Hey, sorry, cat going crazy. But Johnny Rosselli actually ended up dead after being called to testify at the JFK investigation trials with Congress. His body was found like floating in an oil drum and everything because Johnny Rosselli was actually approached by the CIA via Richard Bissell, who was like a higher up at the CIA. And Bissell met Johnny Rosselli in the rest of the Italian mob via Howard Hughes's chief of security. So they kind of plugs in Howard Hughes actually into a lot of the deep state CIA stuff of the Cold War. And you got to think that Howard Hughes was kind of like the Elon Musk of his time. Like Elon Musk, a lot of people think that he's like a super self-made person, but the same way how um, Howard Hughes was basically just winning government contracts and monopolized things. Elon Musk is kind of doing the same thing. But anyways, Sam Giancana, another person of the Chicago outfit, he was actually murdered as well, and supposedly had some ties, possibly to the JFK kind of conspiracy. You have the Tropicante family of Tampa, who are also kind of involved in their plots to kill Castro because they had a lot of gambling interest in Cuba um, before Castro took over. You also had the New Orleans crime family of Carlos Marcello and Silvestro Carollo. And New Orleans is important. Why? Because Lee Harvey Oswald is from there. But also another big person in the JFK conspiracy theory mythology, David Ferry, was also from New Orleans. And New Orleans connects to my previous video where I talk about serial killers and pedophile rings is because one of the most notorious pedophile ring cases of the 70s was Boy Scout Troop 137, I believe, in which it was a fake Boy Scout unit ran by pedophiles who basically would pimp out young boys to wealthy business people. And the attorney general at the time was what's his name? Henry Cossett Jr. or something. Actually, let me get my notes real quick. But oh, actually, what am I doing? I can just go here real quick. Actually, it was where are we at? Where are we at? Yeah, Henry Connick Sr. was the DA at the time, and it's interesting because Henry Connick Sr. succeeded Jim Garrison, and Jim Garrison was the previous, I want to say, main investigator in New Orleans on the JFK case. And allegedly, Henry Connick Sr. Destroyed Jim Garrison's JFK files, basically. Jim Garrison, who I believe was played by what's his name, Kevin Costner in Oliver Stone's JFK movie. Jim Garrison, his whole theory was that there was a big plot to kill JFK based out of New Orleans with people such as Clay Shaw, who interestingly was later determined to have been a contact of the CIA, um, under oath when Richard Helms, CIA director, told Congress that. But Jim Garrison was leading this kind of like New Orleans angle investigation. But New Orleans, like I said, connects back to my whole pedophile serial killer type thing because Boy Scout Troop 137 was located there. And all these names that you see here were all convicted pedophiles mostly. Um, in that connected to the whole Clown and the Candyman documentary, where John D. Norman, who was probably the most prolific kind of pedophile organizer of the 20th century, possibly had ties to both um, Dean Corll, a serial killer called the Candyman out of Houston, but also um, John Wayne Gacy, um, because John Wayne Gacy actually employed a person named Phil Paskey. Phil Paskey actually had a key to John Wayne Gacy's house, and there's a big connection that John Wayne Gacy was actually kind of a part of a larger pedophile ring, and essentially where they were like, after they would abuse people, they would kill them so there wouldn't be any evidence. So basically, just like 70s, 80s, 1970s, 1960s, 70s, 80s kind of pedophile rings out of control, before the country kind of picked up on what they actually were. So if we go back to, where were we at? Here we go. So we can actually go back to La Cosa Nostra, so the New Orleans crime family, but you also had the Dallas crime family with figures such as Joseph Savello. Dallas, of course, is where JFK got killed at. That's also where Jack Ruby had his nightclubs at. And one of the theories I personally had was one of the major pedophile organizers, John D. Norman, in my previous video, who I talked about, may have actually rented out a room to Jack Ruby. But I'm not sure if that's the same John D. Norman. But there's actually like actual proof that Jack Ruby signed a receipt from a John D. Norman in Dallas, Texas, on Ewing Street, Ewing Street, before he killed Lee Harvey Oswald. So there's like this even deeper kind of angle to the whole JFK plot assassination if this whole pedophile serial killer sort of angle is actually true. I'm not saying that it is, but I suspect that it's a possible angle because my personal theory about the JFK assassination is most likely Lee Harvey Oswald was the main culprit or highly involved in it, but it's hard. It's just hard to say. It's like a Rubik's cube. There's just so many different groups where you have the mafia, and not just the Italian mob, but by proxy the Corsican mob. Um, you also have some of these disgruntled anti-Castro Bay of Pig people. One of them, Ricardo Navarrete, Ricardo, or what is his name? Ricardo Morales Navarrete even said that he was in Dallas in a hotel room with other Cubans the weekend that or the week that JFK got killed, allegedly. Um, it's almost as if like the CIA kind of threw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall, knowing that it was going to be impossible to figure out. Even though Lee Harvey Oswald likely was, I think that he actually shot a gun that day. Um, but I'm not too much of the JFK magic bullet kind of, specialist. But it's just interesting to think that there was this underworld possibly of like pedophiles who were also kind of involved, but then also by proxy the organized crime because they were not not only were they selling drugs. If they put it this way, if they kill people and sell drugs, why can't they also sell illegal child content? Some of them, you know. So you have that angle into that world, and then and then also the possibility that some of this every now and then you never know, a PDF could have entered the FBI or the CIA, had a regular job and be a regular person. You just don't know. Um, but like I said, it kind of goes off track a little bit there. But lastly, we also have, when it comes back on track to the assassin angle, there's the Yakuza. The Yakuza, interestingly, are very actually kind of a right wing nationalist sentiment in their kind of gang culture. Um, but the Yakuza were interestingly used by the CIA right after and before the end of World War II, um, and one of those people was Yoshio Kodama. He actually had CIA connections, and his goal, and the CIA used the Yakuza to basically suppress the Japanese Communist movement, um, uh, etc. And then also another person, Masanobu Tsuji. He was actually like a CIA actually informant and agent working for the CIA, who later just like vanished and disappeared. um, and then you also have, lastly on my list, just other Gladio stay behind unit cells like I talked about, but also the World Anti-Communist League. The World Anti-Communist League, whether you like or hate communism is kind of irrelevant, because the World Anti-Communist League was kind of like a front organization, basically for like war criminals and ex-Nazis. Many of them, like Otto Skorzeny, I believe, tried to get connected to the World Anti-Communist League. Um, but regardless, it's just interesting just to kind of put it in some sort of logical order, you know, because the CIA has global scale, just like the KGB had global scale. It's not just the CIA doing messed up stuff. The KGB was doing messed up stuff. Um, you know, the French were doing messed up stuff. English. It doesn't matter. Every country has an intelligence agency. Um, but it's interesting. Oh, and before I end, so Klaus Barbie, right? Um, it's very interesting. He ended up actually having his own mercenary death squad, of a bunch of like it was crazy. It was like a bunch of coked out Bolivian dudes who like who thought that they were Nazis, under the control of Klaus Barbie, who would be like the enforcers for the corrupt government, who would like basically kidnap people who were just like, they would kidnap journalists and stuff like that who spoke out against the government. So it's just kind of wild and crazy to think that like the CIA knew that Klaus Barbie was likely alive and out there doing all this crazy stuff, but didn't care. And was interesting that if you believe that the CIA was involved in drug dealing, by proxy, Klaus Barbie helped in that drug dealing, because he was helping the Bolivian. I think is what's his name? It's I have it written down. It's go here. Here we go. You can scroll in a little bit. So Klaus Barbie had connections to Roberto Suarez Gomez, and they actually did something called the cocaine coup, where they actually took over the government for a little bit. Um, Klaus Barbie also allegedly helped tip off the CIA to the whereabouts of Che Guevara, who was in Bolivia, and the CIA, of course, wanted him dead. So, like I said, yeah, Klaus Barbie, Bolivia, Medellin, Pablo Escobar, Barry Seal, Iran Contra. So you start seeing a lot of these connections all the way from the Bay of Pigs. A lot of the CIA veterans will become station chiefs across the globe, but some of them were involved in overseeing the countries that had some of these prolific, drug dealing networks. And to think that they weren't getting a cut is kind of foolish. So this kind of connects even to Barry Seal, right? So I think with that video, I'll probably wrap it up, and I'll probably go over this kind of slide, or this kind of notes that I kind of took in response to my first video about the serial killers and the pedophile rings. So I'm gonna end this video now and actually wrap it up. So we can actually wrap this up. All right, thank you. All right, bye.